Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be discussing Kyrsten Sinema, the Democratic senator from Arizona, and her exit from the Democratic Party to an independent and what impact that will have not only on the Senate but the 2024 Senate election. So we'll be taking a look at Kyrsten Sinema as an individual, what role she plays in the Senate currently, and how in a 51-49 Senate, her becoming an independent could complicate things for the Democrats. And then finally, we'll also look at the 2024 Senate race, since her leaving the Democratic Party opens the door to a three-way race between a Democrat, a Republican, and an independent in the Grand Canyon state. So we'll take a look at all of that in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So there's always been some tension between Kyrsten Sinema and the Democrats, really ever since she was elected back in 2018. She hasn't voted in line with the Democratic Party as much as other Democratic senators, and she's been a very strong moderate voice in negotiations for a lot of key pieces of legislation under the Biden administration. So a lot of Democrats have been very discontent with Kyrsten Sinema thus far, and if we take a look at some of the primary polling for the 2024 Senate race, it was very clear that Kyrsten Sinema would have probably lost a primary if she had ran as a Democrat in 2024. So it really shouldn't be too much of a shock to us that she did end up leaving the Democratic Party. She was basically dead on arrival in a primary. Now, obviously, in 2 years, a lot of things could change. I would even say if she did run as a Democrat, there's still a potential she could have won the primary purely on the message that, hey, if you don't vote for me, the Republicans will take this seat. Now that she's an independent, I think it's a much more potent argument because realistically, not a lot of Republicans are going to break towards Sinema. They're either going to break between Ruben Gallego, who's probably the likely Democratic frontrunner, even though he hasn't really announced yet, although he has expressed interest publicly, and of course between herself, because I really don't think, unless you run a really weak Republican or crazy Republican like Wendy Rogers or something like that, I think Republicans do have a much more advantageous position in this race than they would have if she had stayed a Democrat. Now, Kyrsten Sinema's run as an independent does open the door for more crossover support. Again, as I mentioned, if the Republicans nominate somebody like Kari Lake or Wendy Rogers, one of those type of candidates, it's very likely you could see as much as 12% of Republicans or something like that vote for Sinema, because now she's not tied to the Democratic label anymore. Even if she does vote in line with the Democrats, she's not a Democrat on paper, and for some Republicans, that might be just enough to vote for her over somebody that they otherwise would disagree with, but would still support because they are a Republican versus a Democrat. Now, looking back at Arizona politically as a whole, this is a state that is trending in favor of the Democrats. We've seen this ever since the era of Donald Trump. In 2016, Donald Trump only won Arizona by 3.5 points or so. Romney won Arizona by about 8. So there was a significant shift to the left. And Arizona had consistently been voting for Republicans in high single digits since Bush 2000. So it wasn't until 2016 that Donald Trump really broke that cycle and, fell in the low single digits. And of course, in 2020, he ended up losing the state very narrowly, but he was the first Republican to lose Arizona since Bob Dole in 1996. And again, it was by a 0.3% margin. So going into 2024, this really is a toss-up seat. Again, we'll talk about the 2024 Senate races later in this video, and I will make a separate video on it in the future because there's really a lot to break down there. And even early on, we're starting to get somewhat of a picture of what's going to happen in those Senate races, what candidates are going to run. And ultimately, it does hinge on, of course, Biden's performance and how well Democrats do with a challenging Senate map there. But Arizona is a leftward trending state overall. Kyrsten Sinema flipped this seat from red to blue in 2018, winning by about 2.4%. In 2020, Mark Kelly flipped this seat again against the same Republican nominee as 2018, Martha McSally, and he also won by 2.4%. And of course, Arizona is trending as leftward as it is because Maricopa County, which makes up over 60% of the state's population, is also leftward trending. It narrowly voted for Trump in 2016, and then in 2020, narrowly went to Joe Biden, and of course, narrowly went to Mark Kelly. Although this is more of a decisive victory, it's really almost 4 points. So you could say in this case, it's not even a narrow victory for Democrats. But Maricopa County, nonetheless, is a very much a swing county. This is a county that usually whoever wins statewide will end up carrying this county. Of course, if the race is extremely, extremely tight and a Republican ends up eking it out, That doesn't always happen to be the case, but usually whatever party wins Maricopa County will end up winning Arizona. Now, I wanted to talk briefly about what impact this would actually have on the Senate, because, of course, after this year's Senate election results, we have a 51-49 Senate. Now, Kyrsten Sinema, I think, is not as likely to caucus with Republicans as she is with the Democrats. I think this shift is much more based on her career goals rather than an ideological shift. Now, obviously, Kyrsten Sinema has felt somewhat out of place in today's Democratic Party, especially with some of the key votes she's taken. She's taken a lot of heat from the Democratic base. But I think it's very unlikely that she ends up caucusing with the Republicans. I think it's more likely that she's an independent that caucuses with Democrats, similar to Angus King in Maine or Bernie Sanders in Vermont. And I still think she'll be a more moderate voice in the Democratic caucus, even though she has left the Democratic Party, because of course she's caucusing with them. She's going to give them 51 seats, but she's going to have much more leverage on key legislation because she's not really bound by party loyalty anymore, even though she's caucusing with the Democratic Party. And of course, her pitch in 2024 to Democratic voters is that if she were not to win the seat, a Republican would, because very likely, as I mentioned earlier, Ruben Gallego and her running on the same ballot would likely split the Democratic vote, even if more Democrats vote for Gallego than Sinema. And I think a Republican would squeak by in that situation. Of course, we're still 2 years away from 2024. A lot could happen. Sinema could decide not to run at all for re-election, although I don't know if she's actually made a decision yet. It looks like she hasn't. I think if she's running as an independent, though, she wants to run for re-election, because if she wasn't going to run, she might as well have stayed as a Democrat anyway, taking the heat while in office and then got some lobbying position once she retired. But now that she is likely going to run, Ruben Gallego's likely to be the Democratic nominee if all's said and done. Maybe Greg Stanton as well if he does run, because he's also a very strong candidate, former mayor of Phoenix, so he could end up beating Gallego in a primary. But regardless, it really does throw a wrench in Democrats' hopes of keeping this seat, because either they're going to have an independent keep this seat or they're going to have a Republican. I think it's very unlikely that in a three-way race at this point in time that a Democrat ends up actually winning that. You would really need a serious vote split by Republicans in favor of Sinema in order to somehow get a Democrat out on top in a three-way race. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Arizona is a leftward trending state. Mark Kelly ended up beating Blake Masters by over 4 percentage points, a pretty solid victory overall. And, you know, Kelly and Sinema are very different as Arizona senators. Kelly is very unapologetically a partisan Democrat that sort of masquerades as this moderate senator. On the contrary, Kyrsten Sinema is very much more an independent-minded senator. Even if she does vote mostly in line with Democratic priorities, she's still much more bipartisan than somebody like Mark Kelly. And a lot of her bipartisanship doesn't necessarily come through the votes she casts, but in the pre-legislative negotiations before the bills actually get to be voted on in the first place. So I would argue that Sinema's much more in line with Arizona voters as a whole, but nonetheless, her becoming an independent does make things very interesting electorally. And if we look ahead at 2024, the Senate races overall, this is going to be a challenging map for Democrats, no doubt. I don't want to make any bold predictions as to how the 2024 Senate map is going to shape up. I'll make a video on that sometime this week talking about where I think things stand right now. But again, predicting things 2 years into the future is pretty hard. Nonetheless, this is going to be a challenging map for Democrats. They're going to be defending a lot of seats, some of which are in states that Donald Trump won twice: Montana, Ohio, and West Virginia. That's 3 pickups right there that, you know, relatively should be easy for Republicans to pick up, provided they run strong candidates. Bob Tester, I think, is probably the strongest of the Democratic incumbents. Joe Manchin's running in a Trump plus 40 state, essentially. Sherrod Brown's running in a Trump plus 8 state. Both of those incumbents are extremely vulnerable. Tester is obviously vulnerable as well. He's run in only favorable years for Democrats. 2006, 2012, and 2018 were all very good years for the Democratic Party. 2024, however, is very much up in the open. I think, again, the top of the ticket is going to be a big factor in this race, because I think if Donald Trump is the top of the ticket, Democrats might have a much easier time winning some of these races than if somebody like Ron DeSantis or some other Republican was at the top of the ticket. And of course, I'll talk more about the 2024 presidential election as we get closer, because now that the midterms are over, really all of the focus has gone to the 2023 races and to a lesser extent, the presidential contest, because we're going to have primaries in less than 2 years on both the Democratic and Republican side. And it's really a question of if Biden decides to run for re-election. I think he's very likely to. And of course, if Trump faces any serious primary challenges, because I know for a fact that we're going to see other Republicans jump in the race that aren't Donald Trump. It's very different than 2020. It's really a question of if the big dark horse, Ron DeSantis, decides to run against Donald Trump in a primary and what that impact would have. And ultimately, who would come out on top? Because I really think it's much more of a question mark than it would have been just a few weeks ago before the midterm election. So we'll get to all of those in future videos. I did want to talk about Sinema switching parties because I do think it is a decently big deal. It does have 2024 implications, but as to whether or not it's going to change her overall voting record, I think it's not as likely. I still think she's going to vote pretty much in line with the Democratic Party, although I think this will give her more of an excuse to vote with Republicans at times since she's no longer bound to the Democratic Party. So anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. And as always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.